That's not creepy.
Good evening, boys and ghouls. Aesthety here, your morbid host for the night. It's that time of the year. Halloween is upon us. So tonight, I am looking at the history of horror classic staple of Haunted House. The Great Manors are a hallmark set for unraveling dread, a stage for unfinished businesses, ancestral chasms, and tragic losses. Filled with overgrown hedges, twisted fences, and crumbling stairways, the architecture in itself is oftentimes one of the main symbols of the genre. And today I will look at the innings of what makes for the spooky architecture and take a swing at the myriad of things, from origins of horror and gothic literature all the way to iconic depictions of haunted houses in media. Join me as I carefully dissect the aesthetics of the genre, its creation of its own visuals of macabre dwellings, and what exactly made the selected styles so deliciously creepy and so culturally iconic to our prying, twisted, fear-obsessed eyes. Welcome to Haunted Mansion Aesthetic Analysis. 1. Origins and cultural relevance. Yeah. Ghosts, the spectre of a soul trapped in its ethereal form in a gloomy world of mortals. Tragic. Spirits, ghosts, and apparitions are almost always bound to a specific place. The legends of haunted houses have long nested within the pages of our history. The earliest surviving record of a haunted house comes from as far as 1st century AD. In a letter written by Pliny the Younger, he describes a notoriously cursed villa in Athens where nobody would dare to live until the arrival of a philosopher named Athenodorus. Tempted by a low rent and unfazed by telltales, Athenodorus had decided to move in spite of house's reputation. And on the first night of his stay, a ghost of an old bearded man in rattling chains appeared to him. The spirit moved about the house and on reaching the courtyard, looked at him, stood still, and vanished. Athenodorus took it upon himself to carefully mark the exact spot where the ghost disappeared, and on the following morning he requested the magistrate to have the spot dug up, and to everybody's surprise, a skeleton of an old man bound in chains was discovered. After the skeleton was given a proper burial, the ghost never appeared again. Pliny's letter is the first ever recording of a strictly domestic haunting that we possess. For the most part in early history, the stories of hauntings were mostly bound to the folklore of particular regions. Local legends of haunted dwellings functioned as in compelling folk tales and served more as a practical forewarning rather than element of literary device. In these, the spirit itself rarely had ill intent, and its apparitions were mostly due to making its case of improper burial or an accused killer. The witness of the haunting seldom was in direct danger. It wasn't until 18th and specifically 19th century where ghosts acquired its infamous brand of malice. It was also the time where the ghost stories evolved from mere regional reports and telltales into a self-aware, narrative-defining leitmotifs in literature. Ghosts, as we know them today from horror stories, fatally dangerous and outwardly seeking to cause harm, begin in the era of Romanticism. Now, quick breeze through some context. Romanticism was an art and literary movement originating in late 18th/early 19th century that primarily focused on cultivating emotion and imagination over the pragmatism of logic and rationality. Within Romanticism itself, two conflicting subgenres soon arose. First one was the light romantics, who had more optimistic outlook They worshipped the idea of human virtue and spirituality. And the second one was dark romantics, who focused mostly on the idea of general human fallibility, self-destruction, judgment, punishment, along with psychological effects of guilt and sin. The dark romantics were drawn to the bad facets of spiritual truth, the dark side of human soul. There's an even darker, grimmer side of the dark romantics, and that is a gothic fiction, which is the dark romantic at its most extreme, involving sheer terror, personal torment, graphic morbidity, madness, and, what interests us the most, the supernatural. Here comes the ghosts, wraths, evil, twisted specters that mercilessly agonize our poor protagonists. But the reason why the gothic fiction is important here is in its unique characteristic as a genre. It is chiefly defined by an overall environment of fear, the threat of the paranormal events, and, most importantly, the intrusion of the past upon the present. This is what distinguishes it from other forms of scary and supernatural stories like myths or fairy tales. This specific theme of present being haunted by the past. It typically includes physical reminders of said past, codified through ruined buildings, which stand as a proof of previously thriving world which is decaying in the present. Here, this warping of time, of past existing and present, is anchored to specific space, and therefore the setting is elevated from mere background to an indispensable element of the plot, almost a character itself. Here comes the importance of aesthetics of our setting as a proactive element of the story. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the characteristic setting include castles, but also religious buildings like monasteries, convents, and crypts. Indeed, of all the types of builds, it was a castle that was the first ever setting in the first Gothic novel ever written, Horace Walpole's 1764 benchmark work, The Castle of Otranto. The story is full of characteristic motifs that establish the Gothic horror as literary genre. The book delves into the subjects such as politics of illegitimacy, abusive betrothal, tragically erroneous murders in the name of birthright, and forbidden love, for the lack of a better word, mixed with supernatural elements of ominous old prophecy, unknown mystical forces, and haunting spirits. All of it played out on the backdrop of a old, foreboding castle. 2. Castle. Ah yes, age-old, mighty towering construction standing unabashedly on some steep hill. It is no surprise that castle is mansion's worthy ancestor, working as a main setting for horror. Part of castle's frightful appeal stems from its primary function. Originated in 9th century Europe and built in stone since 11th century, castles were first and foremost a strategic fortifications, a complex structures combining military, social and administrative uses that served as a playfield for medieval warfare. It was a predominant build in Middle Ages for almost 900 years, witnessing numerous sieges, battles, and a great number of violent deaths. There's so many stories in circulation that attests to real-life castles as an agent of horror. For example, during the renovations of Leap Castle in Ireland in 1922, workmen working in the castle's chapel found a secret dungeon with so many human skeletons that it took them 3 full cartloads to haul them all out. But that's nothing. Apparently the dungeon was designed in a way that the prisoners would fall through the trapdoors and into these so-called oubliettes, a tall underground cell, and right on the 8-feet wooden spikes that were mounted on the floor, all impaled and with broken bones were dying a slow, horrific death, Mortal Kombat style. It's so crazy to think that this could have been a real-life scenario at one point. It's really no surprise that castles are almost always synonymous with telltales of cursed spirits and unnatural creatures.
3. Tudor Manor.
A Tudor-style manor is another to-go-to architectural style of the horror aesthetic. Its origin dates back to the Tudor dynasty and the introduction of Renaissance on the British Isles. It's 16th century and England, under the rule of Elizabeth I, is witnessing a golden age. Along the times of moderate peace, the culture is flourishing and the economy is steadily growing. And old medieval homes are now being fully chimneyed, glazed, elevated, and expanded, while great manor houses, previously set in timber and stone, are now updated with a more sophisticated looks in accordance with new standards of taste and formality. Here emerges the new Elizabethan style, establishing a unique and a completely homebrew take on a continental Renaissance. It is best manifested in a great number of these so-called prodigy houses, a noble estates built in the second half of 1500s that were meant to house the queen and her large retinue each summer while she was participating in her annual royal processions around the country. This look of buildings was carried into the reign of James I and into the so-called Jacobean style of 17th century. Both of these styles had a quick revival in 19th century. This is chiefly why those manors that you recognize from movies are so intensely opulent. But focusing on the look specifically, apart from its gloomy, imposing appearance, it is also to this style of architecture that we owe the horror trope of a secret room. The interiors of Tudor houses were fashionably decked out with small rectangular wooden panels. These mostly were meant to insulate the house and provide a decorative element, but sometimes also appeared to be even more useful. They helped conceiving the entrances to the so-called priest halls, a secret rooms for the Catholic clergy who, while being prosecuted by authorities at the time, could hide to evade capture. This is the genesis of that famous horror motif. It is the houses in Tudor style that still provide for a great wealth of stories of hauntings in UK to this day. According to National Trust, the headless ghost of Anne Boleyn can still be seen in Buckling Hall. Buckland Abbey is haunted by the doomed spirit of a noble who had made a pact with the devil. Or a voice of Lady Cavendish can still be heard centuries after being strangled to death by her husband in Newton Hall. It's really no surprise that uniquely British style of manor houses are lending heavily its aesthetic language to the fictional horror genre.
4. Second Empire Mansion.
Fast forward to 20th century. With the birth of cinema, the cultural fascination of the general public now turns from books to movies, and so the gothic fiction gives birth to the new genre of horror film. Now the elements of its previously established aesthetics had required even more pronounced codification of its tropes, demanded by the definite and unforgivably visual nature of the new medium of the film. And with the US leading the way in the movie industry, Americans had their first dibs in defining haunted dwellings for cinema. And in doing so, they looked into their own regional styles of architecture. Enter our icon.
Oh, no, George, don't. It's full of romance, that old place. I'd like to live in it.
Don't we all know that famously spooky house that is so deliciously creepy and so emblematically American? A little jumbled up structure on the hill or tucked away on the end of the street with its angular roof, dormer windows and a signature tower, all beaming with an ominous energy of all things sinister. We've all seen this type of house in one way or another, be it in art, cartoon, film, or, luckily for some, in person. Listen, as a European, these look so cool to me. If you happen to live nearby one, or even better, in one of these, I'm not partial to invites. Honestly, can they come by? I'll bring the booze. This spooky architectural style is so visually specific, it is impossible to miss. The style is called Second Empire, and it came all the way from France. But how exactly did the French-derived architecture end up in US? And what's more important, how did it become a visual iconic staple of horror? And for that, we must look at its fascinating history. 1852 France. Louis Napoleon comes to power as Emperor Napoleon III and plans a major refurbishment of Paris and, notably, the expansion of Louvre, Paris's inner crowning jewel. Nouveau Louvre dazzles the public, both locally and worldwide, and becomes the exemplar of the Napoleon III Second Empire aesthetic. The highly revered new style is now widely adopted and spread throughout the world. But it wasn't until 1860s that the style became a staple of American architectural vocabulary. Alfred B. Mullett, a supervising architect for the Treasury Department, was responsible for designing federal public buildings across the US and really liked the style. It is to him that we owe spreading of Second Empire across the country. Due to high style, costly size and material, the Second Empire had initially been adopted only by the wealthy elite, but soon it gradually trickled down and transformed into its more modest, affordable subset of vernacular style. The increasing number of American architects studying in École des Beaux-Arts, along with Industrial Revolution provision for newly available manufactured elements of building and ornament, allowed the middle class to enjoy this style as well. And indeed, it is that middle class version of the Second Empire that we mostly associate with the horror. Soon, the winning streak of the style started to show cracks. With the fall of Napoleon III's Second Empire in France and reputation-damaging scandals associated with Albert B. Mullett, by the turn of the 20th century, the style was viewed as completely out of date and emblematic of excesses and Mullett's corruption. The Second Empire continued to garner a large amount of disdain in the public eye. The New York City Hall, Post Office, and courthouse was sneakily called a Mullett's monstrosity in media and subsequently got demolished in 1939. Many other buildings, equally ridiculed, sadly followed suit. Popular magazines of the time began to present this style as something to be proactively hated. And to quote Sarah Burns, professor emeritus at Indiana University, there was a most intense fear and loathing of the Victorian style during the period. Writers and artists and designers all just spurned it, and they all talked about it in the most exaggerated terms. They thought it was filthy and creepy and perverse and horrible and monstrous. And as public buildings fell under the wrecking ball, residential houses, with their wooden facades and expensive to maintain shilling roofs, began to rot and decay, depreciating the aesthetics of suburban streets in the eyes of its neighbors. The style assumed a new role in American collective imagination, captured by Edward Hopper in 1925 painting House by the Railroad. The house seemed to radiate an atmosphere of unease and abandonment, outwardly projecting an energy almost similar to that of liminal spaces, a sad, empty, forgotten byproduct of culture-shifting zeitgeist. This visual and the feelings associated with it was later cemented by Charles Addams, the creator of the Addams Family. which premiered as a series of cartoons in New York in 1938. The sinister cast of macabre characters all lived in that unwanted, towering, decrepit Second Empire mansion. The house became an indispensable part of family's image in our collective imagination. We simply cannot imagine Adam's family without their spooky house. Similarly, the same happened to the Scooby-Doo. In 1960s, the gang of teens, in their attempt at demystifying ghost stories, often explore a number of decrepit ruins that symbolically belong to a discarded past. Throughout the series, the Second Empire houses work as a set for many Mystery Inc. adventures, directly inspired by Edward Hopper's painting and being himself a fan of Charles Adams' works. Alfred Hitchcock was personally very much infatuated with the idea of a Second Empire derelict. He famously used this style in his 1960 movie Psycho. Along with movie's terror-inducing narrative, the Bates Mansion is a hallmark definition of a creepy house.
You see, even in daylight, this place still looks a bit sinister.
The house became a symbol of a scary ominousness of decaying past, prominently featured in all types of media, from cartoons to movies and TV shows. All depictions have contributed to the Second Empire being cemented in our collective imagination as an almost a stock footage of the haunted mansion, an archetype, transforming its forgotten glory of the 19th century and sad neglect of the 20th century into a classic cult element of horror that will always live in our pop culture's memory as a visual icon.
5. The Scare.
Okay, so now we know an in-depth background behind the chosen styles of haunted dwellings. But still, regardless of its style's history, a house is just a house, an outside shell that needs a real meat-on-the-bone story to set things in motion. There's one thing that we need, and that is a pulsating heart of the plot to convey a sense of fright. So how exactly does horror narrative work these visuals to achieve the desired effect of terror? This can happen on a couple of levels.
A. Personal level.
On a personal level, we simply interfere with someone's personal tragedy. At its most private, the abusive marriage, the death of a child, anger, pain, murder, loss. Our presence as a spectator in a space that frames that grand scheme of tragedy seems intrinsically intrusive. And this is transmitted via presence of material culture. Us being there among the privacy of objects of the other disrupts the delicate order of things. That's why it is important that there is a lot of objects to be found there in the first place. We see a myriad of leftover items, buggies, toys, portraits, personal documents, letters, photos. Their multitude is important because it heightens the sense of our invasiveness in said space.
B. Aesthetic level.
Part of the ghoulish appeal circles back to the nature of the visuals themselves. Speaking strictly architecture and interior-wise, why are castles, manors, mansions scary? Apart from being a fortification, some castles seem to induce fear in more conducive way than others. Some of them possess that sense of verticality to their form that translates to this feeling of high-key drama about them. Another thing is this element of heaped-up composition that some of them exhibit. The keep, battlements, oriels, turrets, towers all seem to burst out of the main frame of the build, adding to this menacing feeling as if the building itself keeps mutating. Interior-wise, it is in its duality where lies the fright about its nature. On one hand, it is a residential dwelling where you can eat, sleep and rest, but on the other, it is a terrifying device of medieval war. And there are things designed to remind you of it. Moats such as drowning, portcullises were used to trap and impale soldiers. Even the reason that the staircases and towers run clockwise is to prevent the ascending enemy to move around his sword, making him easier to kill. No need to explain the function of trapdoors, spiked oubliettes, murder halls and dungeons. Castle's architecture is in part as hospitable as it is hostile. You have to be mindful of yourself within its surrounding at all times. The fright of Tudor exterior also lies in the visual protrusion of some of its elements. Unlike classical architecture and its treatment of detail as something integral to the level of surface, the Jacobean leans more on Gothic dynamics in its distribution. The elements all spike up and stand out. We see an outline of outwardly projecting gables, multitude of finials, towers, chimneys. It's all very hard-edged and spiky. In movies, Tudor interior oftentimes is mixed with Gothic revival of 19th century, so we see quite often things like pendant and fan vaulting that gives this feel of spiderweb, and with its structural ribs that allude to the skeletal-like frame to the interior, the rooms almost feel like carcasses. As for the Second Empire, the vernacular style had drastically narrowed the design size while trying to maintain numerous variety of ornamentation that now feels much more heaped up. The dormers, brackets, entablature, crenellation, everything now on a slimmer frame suddenly seems so cluttered, almost like they're festering on the house's main body. Complexity meeting smaller frame is what gives its heavy-hung, sinister feel. In its design, the house tries to be larger than it actually is, and in turn almost eats itself with its own ornamentation. This gives off this towering yet suffocating aura. Also, it doesn't help that most of these houses were built almost exclusively in wood, a material most prone to decay. And as outside, so inside, what gives us the creeps is the equal expression of heavy-handed clutter. Rooms full of rich, plush fabrics, damasks, velvet-covered walls and upholstery, while thick curtains protected interiors from drafts in winter and sun bleaching of fabrics in the summer, all kept rooms in a semi-permanent darkness. Add to this the typically Victorian tendency to collect an insurmountable number of objects and knickknacks while chaotically mixing styles of different provenances. Think taxidermied animals next to Chinese vases, next to Flemish chairs, next to grandma-made dollies, next to Rococo consoles, and everything in between. All of that was stuffing the rooms up to its very edges while drowning them in twilight, dust, and mustiness at all times. You can only imagine the stagnancy of air caused by the tight mixture of objects and materials. In this setting, the scare almost writes itself.
C. Psychological level.
Its 19th century tradition dictates that Gothic fiction, beyond the surface level scares, oftentimes should serve as a metaphorical expression of deeper psychological and social conflicts. On the psychological level, this is where the mansion oftentimes become the character itself, with attributed behaviors and impulses, with suddenly animated zoomorphism and anthropomorphism via its elements of decor. The house serves as a visual contraption acting out of its own agency. The multiplicity of rooms, dead ends, and constantly changing nature of the interior is an expression of supernatural menace. Edgar Allan Poe, in its 1839 story, explores this idea of house as a quasi-organism that reflects the internal condition of the main character in the house itself and its appearance. Sometimes the visual phantasms and inescapable hostile architecture is really an expression of our character's own convoluted psyche, be it either an encroaching madness or repressed subconscious. In The Haunting of 1963, the main protagonist cannot overcome her longing to be needed, being abused by her needy yet ruthless sick mother. In Turning, based on 1898 ghost story The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, the babysitter cannot make amends with the possibility of her hereditary insanity. All of this is reflected by the haunted house's active interaction with the characters. It is a riff on Freudian theory. The feelings and thoughts repressed for the sake of normality are bound to resurface later on and in uglier ways. The house, with the sum of its aesthetic elements, is that manifestation of uglier ways, providing us with a tormenting playground for our frail psychological condition.
D. Socio-Political Level.
Sometimes the fright is even more abstract. The main framework for it is not that the tragedy lies within the character as an individual, but rather as a representative of a bigger social order. This is played out on hanging up on class disparity, privilege guilt, or the degeneracy of our superiors, all of it aiming to show a larger problems of class structure, which derived from the traditions of dark romantics. The very birth of Gothic literature is thought to have been influenced by the political upheavals of the time. Researchers linked the English Civil War and Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 to the first Gothic novel, Castle of Otranto, we spoke about earlier. A collective political memory and any deep cultural fears associating with the times likely contributed to the early Gothic villains as literally representatives of defeated Tory barons or royalists rising from their political graves in the pages of early Gothic novels to terrorize the bourgeois reader of late 18th century England. Horace Walpole's family fortunes directly stemmed from the fall of monarchy, and his personal sense of guilt is represented in the character of Mansfield in Castle of Otranto. Class tension and economic social turmoil is brilliantly depicted in Winchester. Sarah's main occupation in life is the containment of evil souls that dwell in her house. Their tragedy directly caused by the very thing that is a source of Sarah's prosperity. She uses architecture as a material manifestation of her own psyche to either make amends or at once and for all repress the existence of the undead. She is the symbolic representation of systemic guilt. But sometimes the class dynamics are reversed. The Victorian act of safeguarding expensive furnitures and fabrics with heavy window curtains, and the mishmash of clutter seemingly collected at random that generated a garish clash of references, was what amounted to upper classes' fear about the advancing prosperity of the middle class. We see many critiques written at the time that condemn this ugly accumulation and propose a reform of overall mainstream style as a means of safeguarding morality. Here, the source of initial horror was the ostentatiousness and exercise of blind bad taste of financially advancing opportunist middle class. On the other hand, nothing tastes more bitter than old money bankruptcy. The very sight of large manor made to beam with prosperity and life, suddenly at once deserted, its wounded magnificence attesting to the shame that induces feeling of cursed jadedness. When the powers are lost, and wealth along with it, the very opulence caused by the complexity of the forms turns into its own very opposite, a dramatic high-key tragedy, generational fall from grace, a glory irreversibly lost. In The Little Stranger of 2018, this is cleverly depicted in socially inverted dynamic. The main character of the working class background roots for the poverty-stricken aristocratic family, having witnessed their manor in its heyday as a child. Deeply entrenched in the visions of splendor from his childhood memories, he maniacally attempts to assert himself into this lost image. For him, the ends justifies the means, regardless of consequence. This is the main driving factor of the haunting in this movie. An unhealthy obsessions and rigid class immobility is what leads to everyone's downfall. The main point being, you can technically get what you want, but you will get, however, will be empty, rotting, haunted. So, be careful what you wish for. Alright then, thanks so much for watching guys. I hope that you liked my take on haunted architecture. What is your favorite haunted house horror? I would love to find some more obscure titles and hidden gems that I might have not seen yet. Drop me some recommendations below. Go and enjoy All Hallows Eve. wherever you are, until we meet again on the other side.